By relying almost entirely on one plugin, I took a mix from sounding like this to sounding like this. Of all the many channel strip plugins available on the market today, one seems to have been emulated by more plugin companies than all the others, and that's the SSL 4000 console. From Waves to Brainworks to Universal Audio to SSL themselves, there's no shortage of options if you're looking to add the legendary sound and layout of the SSL 4000 console into your workflow. And if you're working in the box, I would argue that an SSL 4000 plugin is one of the best investments you can make. Let's talk about why. SSL 4000 series consoles first appeared in the late 1970s and quickly became the go-to for professional recording studios. They introduced what I like to call a comprehensive workflow, which set the standard for recording and mixing technology. With the help of these consoles, legendary mixing and recording engineers like Chris Lord-Alge, Tom Lord-Alge, Bob Clearmountain, Andy Wallace, and countless others shaped the sound of the 80s and 90s. The SSL 4000 wasn't just a tool for these engineers, it was the foundation of their mixing workflows, which allowed them to work more quickly and more creatively. And that's where the magic lies. It's not just in the sound, but it is in how it set the standard for mixing workflows that has since been matched by many but never beat. What initially attracted engineers to the SSL 4000 in the days of analog is that it bridged a pretty massive gap between creative vision and enacting that vision onto recorded sound.
It let me, as a creative, be at one with the music. I was able to be a part of the music and be able to touch the music and make changes to it instantaneously.
It put everything engineers needed at their fingertips: EQ, compression, gating, setting mix levels, setting monitor levels, all in one place. No more wasting time on complex patching systems or having to rely on outboard gear. And that's to say nothing about features like fader automation or the ability to save and recall mix sessions. Now today, most of the problems that the SSL 4000 console solved are largely irrelevant to us. If you work in the box like I do, then you already don't have to worry about patch bays or maintaining analog equipment, and things like being able to save and recall your session are basic features of not just your DAW, but any software application. However, the fundamental idea behind the design of the SSL 4000 console wasn't just to solve its contemporary problems. It was to enable creativity. And that principle is as true of the software emulations today as it was of the original hardware. So in 2024, what are the technical problems hindering our creativity? Well, think about your DAW for a minute. Fresh session, blank canvas, and you want to process your drum bus. What's the first thing you're likely to start thinking about? Probably which plugin to start with, right? Should you EQ first or compress first? Should it be an LA2A or an 1176? Does it need saturation? Where does that go in your chain? I think you're probably starting to get the point. In modern DAWs, we have nearly infinite options, which is a great thing. But what ends up happening is we spend just as much, if not more time, deliberating over which plugins we should be using than it took engineers in the 70s to simply patch together their outboard equipment. Now, I'm sure some of you are rolling your eyes because, let's be real, it doesn't take that long to pull up an LA2A or a Pro Q3. But as trivial as this process may now be, it is still a very technical one. An SSL 4000 plugin, just like the original console, turns what was once a technical process into a creative one. Take what Chris Baseford has to say about his mixing workflow using an SSL channel strip plugin. He's known for producing and mixing bands like Nickelback, Shinedown, and Daughtry.
SSL channel on every single one. You know, if I need to add some top end, boom, there's top end. It's really fast. What's the decision-making tree? Low end, yes or no? Open the plugin. Yes. Did that cause more problems? Is it the right frequency? Not the right frequency. I go to the frequency. What frequency did I end up on? I don't know. I fixed the problem. Move on.
With everything in one plugin, you can easily make creative decisions without getting bogged down in the technical details. You can focus on the music, which is ultimately the goal for any audio engineer. I'll leave a link to the full interview of Chris Baseford in the description below. All right, let's finally take a look at one. All right, so I've got my session pulled up here, and as you can see, I've got a 4K channel strip plugin on just about every channel here. So for this, I'm pretty much just going to talk about the drums because I think we can cover pretty much all our bases regarding this plugin just by talking about drum processing. So we'll start with the close mics then, and I process the close mics of my shells pretty much the same way. So it'll be enough for me to just talk about my snare mic here And you can extrapolate that to the other drum mics as well. All right, so let's start with the input section. So I've got my input trim here, which is the equivalent to like a line input on an analog console. And this is just setting my levels going in. You know, in this case with my snare drum, I decided to bring it up and then I just compensated it with the out trim. So if I turn everything else off here and just A/B this, there's no audible difference. And then the next thing is I've got the mic input, and this is the equivalent to an actual mic input on an analog console. And SSL, who actually made this version of the plugin, modeled the actual Jensen preamp of the 4KE. And so when we bring this up, we actually are bringing the signal up and we're running it into this model of the Jensen preamp. But it's gain compensated. So we're not making the signal coming out of the plugin any louder, but we are actually increasing the level going into the preamp model, which causes it to distort the same way that the actual Jensen mic preamp would distort. And so this basically allows us to add as much saturation as we want without messing up our gain staging. And this preamp is actually where much of the sound of the 4KE console comes from. When you push the preamps and the fader VCAs and the summing VCAs, you introduce a lot of harmonic distortion into the signal that is oriented mostly in the upper mid-range, which are the frequencies we generally describe as punchy. So when our signal running through the 4KE starts to distort, it does so in a way that we describe as aggressive and punchy, which is what the 4KE is known for, and it's kind of the most well-known of the 4000 series plugins. That sound really did define the sound of the 80s and 90s. Back in the day, this was actually called bending the board. It might actually still be called that, where you are basically trying to push your input and output transformers as much as you can to get as much character from the console as you can. And then we've got an output fader, and SSL also modeled the individual VCA of the output fader, which was a DBX gold can VCA. And I like to use the fader for any kind of gain compensation after doing my EQ and compression. So oftentimes when I'm compressing, especially, the signal will start to sound a bit louder. And so I'll just use the fader to bring that back down. So let's talk next about the routing section. So the ability to like modify the signal flow from within the console itself is actually a pretty unique feature for the time. And in this case, I have my signal running into my high and low pass filters first, and then into my dynamics section, and then into my EQ. And the reason I like to do that is because the first thing I want to do is filter out any kind of top end bleed from like the cymbals and hi-hats, and then also any low end bleed from maybe the kick and the toms. So on this particular plugin, you have three options as far as EQ circuits. You have the brown knob circuit, the black knob circuit, and the orange knob circuit. The black and orange knob circuits both have 18 dB per octave slopes, which is closer to the sweet spot for me when it comes to filtering my drums. So for me, this was good enough. And then from there, I run my signal into the dynamic section. And the first thing I dial in is the gating. I've obviously got it on fast mode to take care of transients, but I also put it on expansion mode. So when I hit this, it just gives the gate a softer knee, which sounded a little bit better in this case. And then I'm just adjusting the range to taste. I like to leave a little bit of bleed in there still because it just sounds more natural. We can also compare it to the fast mode. Probably have to have my release quite a bit faster. But I just don't like how it's got all that bleed. It kind of has this hold before it starts to release. So you get this whoosh, 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 which I don't really like. So again, put it on expander mode, and then I can use a faster release time. All right, so let's talk about the compressor. The compressor is really good for drums because it's got a program-dependent attack time. And what that means is the attack time will vary depending on the signal it's receiving, anywhere from 10 milliseconds to 30 milliseconds. And a very popular way to compress your drums is to compress them with a slow attack because you can emphasize the transient more and get more attack out of your drum. But now we're getting more bleed. So I'm going to bring my range up a bit. And this is actually another thing I really love about using channel strip plugins is that I've dialed in my gating and things like that. I've got a sound I like, and I move on to the next step. I start compressing, but now I've changed the sound, and now I've kind of undone this balance I had with my gate. But instead of having to like close my plugin and open up my gate again, I just go down to the range knob, bring it up a bit, and we're back to where we wanted to be. Okay, so since I've taken care of my top end EQ by using the compressor, I can just focus on treating my low end. And I really like the orange knob circuit for my drums because the orange knob circuit's actually called the Pultec circuit. It's not actually a passive circuit, but it has very similar roll-offs as with a Pultec. So I put my crossover frequency at 100 Hertz like it would be on a Pultec and just boosted here. And then I've added a cut here at 500 Hertz. And I'm using wider Q factors here because the orange knob circuit, like the mid bands on the orange knob circuit, are very aggressive. So a lot goes a long way, and they are proportional Qs. So the more you boost or cut, the narrower the Q gets. So I like to have a broader Q factor just to give myself some more headroom. All right, so let's talk about my overheads real quick. So this is the first instance of me using the brown knob circuit because I like the softer slopes on the high and low pass filters because I'm doing some pretty aggressive filtering here. So I just brought those down till I was getting rid of that hiss, and they did sound a little bit dark. And so I just made another boost at 8K and it kind of just shifted that top end energy kind of into the right place for me. All right, so let's move on to my rooms, and this is where I actually start to do my processing on group tracks. So similar thing as with the overheads, I'm using the brown knob circuit and aggressive filtering here. And this is my first instance of using an outboard piece of gear, a different plugin. And the main reason for that is I like the way the distressor sounds more than the channel strip compressor for drum rooms, which is probably an obvious one for many people. The distressor kind of feels like it was made for drum rooms. In fact, it kind of was. This nuke setting was like actually put in there for that exact purpose. But the second reason I'm using the distressor instead of the channel compressor isn't really relevant to us in the digital realm, but I still think it's pretty interesting. So let's talk real quick about the way summing or busing works on the actual 4000 console. In a DAW, when we send our tracks to a subgroup, we just get a stereo track that lets us control that subgroup. So if I just wanted to use my channel strip plugin on my stereo track, I can. This is just a stereo version of the channel strip. However, in the analog realm, on the 4KE at least, you don't have stereo channel strips. So what would happen is you would route all of your mono drum channels to a stereo group, and the output of that group would go into two different mono channels panned hard left and right. So if I wanted to use the channel compressor to compress my room mics, I would end up having to compress the left and right channels individually. And this can be problematic because it can introduce phase issues and mess with your panning because you are compressing both sides differently. And so a lot of outboard equipment like compressors were designed to handle stereo signals. So even though you theoretically could just use the channel compressors, you would get a much more reliable result by sending those two signals to a stereo compressor and then back into your board. So this is entirely irrelevant to us now that we're in the digital realm, and this is a stereo version of the channel strip doing stereo processing, but I thought it'd be fun to mention. So this is actually a great segue into the all drums group because I actually am using a stereo instance of the channel strip plugin for the sole purpose of using its compressor. This time I'm using the SSL 4KB instead of the 4KE, and these are my compressor settings: 2:1 ratio. These are stepped options, so it's not a variable ratio like on the 4KE. So I have the choice between 2:1, 4:1, and 10:1. I set mine to 2:1 here, and then I've got my release on DS mode. And what that essentially does is give us a very fast release. I'm assuming it's somewhere around 100 milliseconds, and a very fast attack as well. I'm guessing it's around 30 microseconds, the same way the 4KE was, because that's how it sounds. And it does something pretty crazy to the drum sound. Okay, so what's actually going on here? So it's a very fast release and fast attack. So what's happening is that we're kind of rounding out the transient a bit, which maybe seems counterintuitive because we do take a lot of care to like protect the transients of our drums and to emphasize them. And now we're kind of squashing them. But what's actually happening is yeah, we are rounding out the transient, but it does sound very pleasant. And we're also emphasizing the sustain of the drum, but not just from the drum mics themselves, but from the overheads and from the rooms. And so we end up with a very like cohesive sound. This is a drum compression technique that I learned from a mentor of mine named Jay Moss. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. Really cool guy. He used to play in a band called Defeater. He's in a band now called Love Letter, and they'll be on tour soon. So if you're in Europe, check them out. But anyway, you can do the same thing on the 4KE as well. So we've got fast attack, which on the 4KE is 30 microseconds. And then we've got fast release, 100 milliseconds. And this time we're going with like a 3-to-1 ratio, which is usually what I like to go for. It's not available on the 4KB, but the 2-to-1 was fine. Even though you can just as easily dial in the same style of compression as with the 4KB, the reason I opted for the 4KB or the 4KE is because the 4KB is known for having a much more warm and like vintagey sound. And that's because when you are pushing the preamps and the VCAs on the 4KB, it's creating a lot of harmonic distortion in the lower mid-range. So whereas the 4KE is known to be aggressive because of its orientation towards the upper mid-range, the 4KB is known for its orientation towards the lower mid-range, which is great for this style of compression because we are trying to emphasize the sustain of our drums, which primarily live in the lower mid-range. And again, if we were doing this old school, we might opt to go with a stereo compressor in our outboard rack. And I really love using the API 2500 for that. Here's how that sounds. Now I know I said that we'd be focusing on just the drums for this demo, but I would be remiss not to also mention the well-renowned 4K bus compressor, the G-Bus. So let's take a listen to the entire mix with this engaged. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my take on the SSL 4000 console. There's so much more I would have loved to talk about. So if there's anything that you would have liked me to go deeper on, or something that wasn't covered, or maybe just something I got wrong, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, if you or someone you know is in need of any kind of music related services, such as recording, mixing, mastering, producing, help with songwriting, I will leave a link to my email and SoundBetter profile in the description below. And until then, take care.